Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 19 in our course on General Psychology. And in this lecture, we're going to continue our unit on higher level cognition. And in particular, we're going to be talking about thought, about thinking. So we'll learn about concepts. So how do people form abstract categories? We'll be talking about decision making quite a bit, how people make decisions based on the information available, and the ways in which perhaps our decision making is not as good as it could be. We'll also talk about problem solving and reasoning, how to draw conclusions, and creativity and insight. All these higher level functions that we use all the time without really thinking about it. But we'll be looking at the psychology of higher cognition today. So in particular, what we're going to do is look at different theories on how we form concepts. So how do we group information? How do we form categories? There's not just one rule for doing that, and we do it pretty intuitively. But the question is, how does that happen in the brain? And what are the rules for forming concepts when it comes to human cognition? We'll also see when it comes to decision making that people pretty consistently uh, make errors in judgment. And a lot of these errors are the result of taking shortcuts, of not having a good handle on things like probability. And so we tend to make some systematic mistakes. And perhaps these mistakes occur because they served our ancestors well enough to get by, but we're presented with different kinds of problems now. And so the old ways we used to make decisions may not be the best ways anymore. We'll also look at the link between decision making and the brain. So, what parts of the brain are involved in different kinds of decisions? Uh, what experiments have been done looking at this connection between decision making and the brain? And then we'll look at reasoning. And some forms of reasoning we're pretty good at, some things we're not so good at. So we'll look at that as well. So we'll start by looking at concepts. And a concept is a kind of mental representation. It's a way of grouping items together, grouping knowledge together into categories. And the members of such a group should have shared features. That's what makes them uh, eligible to be in the same group. And these items could be physical objects, they could be people, they could be abstract ideas, they could be events. Any number of things can come together in our formation of mental concepts. But the general idea is that it's a category. So how do we form concepts? How do we put things into categories? And one of the earliest ideas in psychology in this theme is to come up with necessary and sufficient conditions. So a necessary condition is something the item has to have in order to be eligible for membership. A sufficient condition is something that if the item has it, it's automatically a member of the category. So your book uses the category of dogs, um, and so that's a pretty good category. Everyone knows what a dog is, and we have a pretty intuitive grasp of what things are dogs, what things are not. So it's necessary for the thing to be a mammal. There aren't any dogs that aren't also mammals. But just because something is a mammal doesn't make it a dog. So being a mammal is not sufficient, but it is necessary. Whereas if the item is a poodle, well, that's sufficient if you already know that a poodle is a type of dog. Uh, so that's all well and good. But it turns out people don't really form categories that way. So if you have an idea of what dogs are, and we all do, uh, what are the necessary conditions for being a dog, other than being a mammal? What are the sufficient conditions for being a dog, other than belonging to a breed that you already know belongs to the concept of dogs? So people are hard pressed to come up with labels, to come up with conditions that are necessary or sufficient. And yet everyone is able to communicate with one another about concepts without explicitly going into necessary and sufficient conditions or even having them necessarily. So necessary and sufficient conditions is rigorous, as a framework, but it's not very useful. An easier framework is what's called family resemblance theory. And this is the idea that members of a category, members of a concept, don't necessarily all have the same feature in common, but they have groups of features. And one individual might have different overlapping features with another than with some third member of the category. But there's sort of a collection of features that not having any one feature doesn't exclude you from the category. But if you have enough of these features that you have that family resemblance, you belong to that concept. Uh, and this is an easier approach to this problem. But there's been work that's been done since the development of family resemblance theory as well. It's a little vague. Uh, One of these is prototype theory. The idea here is that you have a single member of the concept that really is the prototype. It is the best member of the group, the one that represents all of the necessary features, all the relevant features. And so if you have a prototype for what a bird is, so you have some generic bird concept. And so you determine whether a new candidate for being a member of this concept, uh, whether it belongs or not by comparing it to the prototype. So you have one prototype that everything gets compared to because it is the ideal member of the group. And that's another possible framework. Uh, but it's also true that coming up with a prototype may not be so easy, and that having a prototype may cause you to miss members that should belong to the concept because of the particular prototype you've selected. Another theory is what's called exemplar theory. And this is the idea that if you have members that belong to this concept, that anytime a new one comes along, that you can compare it to all those stored memories of other members of this concept. And so you have some new possible member of the dog group. You compare it to these other dogs that you know belong to the concept, and you see how well the new member fits. And so you compare it to these previous exemplars. Okay, so we have these different frameworks for how we might form concepts. Uh, do any of these actually seem to have any traction in the brain? And the answer is yes, that different hemispheres of the brain, as it turns out, seem to deal with two of these different models for how we form concepts. And we don't need to belabor this, but the left hemisphere of the brain seems to deal mainly with prototype theory. So if you present information to the right visual field, if we remember weeks ago, we learned that opposite sides of the brain deal with a given side of the visual world. So the left hemisphere processes the right visual field. If you present prototype related information, that the left hemisphere seems to deal with that. Uh, Exemplar theory seems to be captured in the right hemisphere of the brain. So the answer seems to be that we use both prototype and exemplar approaches, and the different hemispheres of the brain specialize in one approach or the other. What's also interesting about the brain when it comes to concepts is that you can develop category-specific deficits. So if a person has a stroke or an injury, they can lose the ability to identify some categories, some concepts, but not others. So obviously it's not the case that all concepts are stored in the same place in the brain, or that all concepts and categories depend on the same set of neurons. So you might lose the ability to identify man-made objects, but still be able to identify animals and people, or vice versa. You could lose the ability to identify other people, but you can still identify tools, for example. And so there are specific deficits for a given category of item, which leads to the question, are there sort of so-called natural categories? Are we hardwired to come up with certain categories of items? Now, we don't want to take this idea to the extreme. Um, we're not born with different concepts and different categories for cars and trucks, for example. But broader categories seem to be fairly consistently separated physically in the brain. And so the difference between living items and non-living items, so animals and tools, seem to occupy different parts of the temporal lobe. You can lose one of these categories and not lose the other, again, if you have a stroke or some sort of traumatic brain injury. So the idea here is that uh, people are innately prone to make certain categorizations. Even individuals that are congenitally blind will have these different categories in these consistent locations in the brain for things like animals and tools. So it doesn't depend on visual processing or visual experience with the items, for example. Okay, so moving on to another important cognitive capacity, and that is decision making, our ability to make choices. So researchers coming from disciplines like economics started off with what's called rational choice theory. And this is the idea that an individual makes optimal decisions by placing value on different options and then choosing the option that has the highest value. So, for example, if you have a number of items that you can purchase, uh, the one with the highest value is the one that would be perhaps the most useful to you or provide the most long-term benefit or that you just like the most. And so while applying value is itself can be a difficult process, the idea that we pick the choice with the highest value has a certain intuitive appeal. And if you lived your life that way, you might make pretty good decisions. But it turns out that rational choices are not very good at describing people's everyday behavior. That there are a lot of inconsistencies. There are a lot of ways in which our behavior and our decision making are irrational. One thing that is necessary to make value-based decisions that people are not very good at is understanding probability. So that is the odds that something will happen. And there's been a fair amount of research done on this. And people don't treat probability the way a computer would, or the way that a mathematician would in general. Uh, they have what we would call a subjective probability. So everyone knows what 50-50 means. It means you're just as likely to win as to lose, or you're as likely to get outcome one as outcome two. So people get that pretty close to right. Um, and people know what 100% chance means. People will know what a 0% chance means. But it's that those middle values that become difficult. So if I tell you there's a 99% chance of something happening, or a 99.9% chance of something happening, people treat those as more or less the same. When in fact the odds of one in one case of the event not happening are 10 times as high as in the other case. So 99 versus 99.9% is notable difference, but people treat it as though it were the same. Also, people treat 30% not that differently from 60%, even though you're doubling probabilities. And so this lighter curve here in this diagram shows how people think of probability as a function of what the actual probability is. So it's not a straight line. People do not treat subjective probability, do not think of probability in the way that it objectively occurs. We distort it. We overestimate rare events, and we also overestimate uh, things that are likely but are not sure things. And so our understanding of probability is often not so great, and that can lead us to misestimate uh, our choices. And one important topic in the realm of decision making is the difference between algorithms and heuristics. An algorithm is a process for solving a problem. It can be complex, it can be time consuming, but it will solve the problem. It is foolproof if you devote time and effort. But most people don't use algorithms. Most people use heuristics. And a heuristic is a rule of thumb. It is a shortcut for getting to an approximate answer, and it probably serves its purpose most of the time. But it can also get us into trouble when it gives us an inaccurate picture of what of choosing an option is going to lead to. And there's a growing discipline called neuroeconomics. So economics put forth rational choice theory, the idea of a rational decision-making agent. And again, that has not panned out so well when describing behavior. But neuroeconomics is a relatively new approach, still looking to keep an economic framework for things like value, concepts like probability, uh, and yet trying to understand that people don't make rational decisions in the traditional sense, and yet still try to understand how it is they make decisions. How do we describe their decisions? How do we quantify biases and errors that people make when they're making decisions? So, for example, if you've ever heard of a utility function, this is an idea from economics that has also gained some traction in psychology. In fact, applying this to psychology has granted has gotten some people the Nobel Prize. So the idea of having a subjective value is really important. Uh, $5 may be worth a lot more to one person than it is to another, depending on their circumstances. Objectively, it's $5. The value literally is the same, but the subjective value can differ quite a bit. And so that is just one concept from economics that's starting to be applied to human beings and their decisions. And it's a lot of these concepts are pretty useful in understanding why people don't make rational choices all the time, so to speak. Okay, so we all have these heuristics, these rules of thumb that we use to make decisions, but they can often get us into trouble because they're not guaranteed to be accurate. One commonly made error is what's known as the availability bias. So when we're asked to estimate the frequency of a particular event, we often base our estimate uh, off of how easy it is to retrieve information. So, for example, if I asked you which is more likely to die in a shark attack or to die from being hit by falling airplane parts. So think about for a moment which of those you think is more likely. Now, most people say that death by shark attack is more likely. In fact, it is the death by falling airplane parts. The reason people say shark attacks are more likely to cause death is that it's easy to remember media stories about shark attacks or anecdotes about shark attacks. They're more prominent in our culture. They are more emotionally salient. So when you try and think about each of those events, you're going to come up with more information about shark attacks than you are falling airplane parts. And your heuristic leads you to conclude that shark attacks must be more frequent. Uh, but in fact, it's just that it gets reported more, that it's a more emotionally salient. That's why it's easy to recall, because it is more familiar, not because it is statistically more likely. Another common error is the conjunction fallacy. And this is often described with the following story or account. And so you hear about a woman named Linda who was a philosophy major and is during college cared a lot about human rights topics. And then you're asked which is more likely, that Linda is a bank teller or that Linda is a bank teller and a feminist. And amazingly, most people said that the second case was more likely, when in fact it cannot be more likely than just being a bank teller. So while it seems more plausible, it fits better with the story. Uh, Feminist bank tellers are a subset of bank tellers. So it cannot be more common to be a feminist bank teller than just to be a bank teller. One is a subset of the other. So this is the conjunction fallacy, when you conclude that a combination of features is more likely than the features by themselves, just because it fits with the backstory better. So that is another logical fallacy, but people make that all the time. Another common one is the gambler's fallacy. And so, as the name suggests, you see this a lot in people who gamble, but it crops up in other uh, walks of life as well. And this is the idea that uh, future outcomes depend on previous outcomes when they are in fact independent. So somebody playing roulette has seen it come up red 4 times in a row, and then bets on black because it's due, or because it hasn't come up in a while, when in fact it's just as likely to come up red again. Similarly, people talk about sports teams and say that this team is going to win because they're due, because they've been losing recently, and so they're due for a win. When in fact they're probably no more likely to win the next game than they were to win the previous games. And so the gambler's fallacy stems from a misunderstanding of probability. That's another way in which people are not very good at probability. They think that uh, future lottery drawings will be affected by the numbers that were drawn before. So these are all forms of the gambler's fallacy. There's also the base rate fallacy. And this is where people fail to take into account the underlying likelihood of certain events. And related to this, and this is mentioned in your book, is the representativeness heuristic. So again, you're given a story about an individual. You know that people in this pool of individuals you're hearing about are either engineers or lawyers. And you hear about a person who is fastidious, is not particularly social, is detail oriented, and you're asked to assess whether that person is an engineer or a lawyer. Now you know that 70% of the people in this pool are lawyers, and yet people will overwhelmingly guess the individual being described as an engineer. It fits the description better. And while descriptions can be informative, they should not trump the the evidence that you already have in hand. So if you just picked a person randomly out of the pool, the odds would be 70% that they were actually a lawyer. Now again, maybe your description biases you a little bit, but you shouldn't ignore the base rate, that is the underlying likelihood of being an engineer or a lawyer. If I told you that there were 99 lawyers and 1 engineer, how likely would you be to say that that person was still an engineer? Uh, but this crops up in all sorts of circumstances, including our criminal justice system. People misunderstand the base rates of certain crimes or certain features in identifying people, and they go more on the qualitative descriptions, and they ignore the underlying data. There are also framing effects, and this is a topic we already got into in our unit on emotion and motivation. We talked about how framing a question, the language we use, can bias people's decisions. You can give the exact same information, the exact same decision being made, and yet the way it's described can have a huge impact on what people do. So in our previous unit, we used the vaccine example, that if you describe it in terms of saving lives, that people make different decisions versus if you describe it in terms of deaths, even though the outcomes are the same. So one framing effect is what's called the sunk cost fallacy. So the sunk cost fallacy can be captured in the aphorism, throwing good money after bad. So when you've already invested in something, people tend to keep on investing in it, even if that's irrational. So they put some money into, or some time, into an entity, into an item, and they'll keep on putting more money into it, more resources, even when that investment isn't paying off. And they might tell themselves, well, I've already put so much into this. So your book uses the example of sports stars, that uh, paying a particular player might be very expensive. And yet, if they are not performing, teams will often still continue to put that player in games because they've already put so much money into them. While that does not affect, of course, the probability that the player will begin performing. Uh, Another example is in relationships. So people invest a lot of effort, a lot of resources into interpersonal relationships, and sometimes they do not work. Sometimes they're not beneficial. They can be harmful. And yet people will tell themselves, oh, I've already invested so much in this relationship, I'm going to stick with it. And so the sunk cost fallacy, again, touches a lot of different areas of our lives, not just monetary investment, but personal and social investment as well. There's also what's known as the endowment effect, and this is a really interesting one. So the endowment effect is an effect by which simply owning an item causes you to place a higher value on it. So in an experiment, they have people uh, judge the value of an item, in this case, a coffee mug. How much would you pay for this coffee mug? This is a way of asking what its value is. How much would you pay for it? And they'll give some answer, $5. So they have some value for this coffee mug. And that in and of itself is fine. There's no problem there. However, if you then give the person the coffee mug, the item has not changed. But if you ask how much would you sell it for, the answer is much larger. So their value of the item seems to have changed depending on whether or not they own the item or not, whether or not it's theirs. So people tend to place more value on items in their possession than if the items were not in their possession and they had to pay for them. So again, this is irrational. If an item has value, it should have the same value whether you own it or someone else owns it or it is unowned. So that's the endowment effect. It's another way of framing a decision. And if we frame it as being your item as opposed to not your item, its value somehow changes. There's also the certainty effect. So people will prefer sure bets, uh, even irrationally so, even if what we call the expected value of an option is higher. So if I offer you $10 or a 50% chance of winning $20 and a 50% chance of getting nothing, most people will choose the sure thing. Now, the expected value there is the same. If I chose that second option again and again and again, uh, I would end up on average making $10 each time. So the values objectively are the same, but people like the sure thing. And in fact, you can offer people a 50% chance of $25, and they will often still choose the sure thing, even though now you should be biased toward the gamble. And so that is the certainty effect, the tendency to choose a sure thing over a gamble, even if on average the gamble should pay off more. And one explanation that's been put forth for this is what's called regret minimization. And so the idea here is that I choose not based just on value. I choose based on partially on value, but also after my choice, depending on the outcome, how will I feel about it? So if I choose the $10 sure thing, I'll feel pretty good about that. If I choose the gamble, if I lose on the gamble, well, then I'm going to feel bad about it. Now, I can avoid feeling bad. I can avoid losing that gamble by taking the sure thing, assuming that if I choose the sure thing, I don't find out what the outcome would have been. So that way I don't have to worry about whether I would have won or lost. And that feels better than the possibility of taking the gamble and then losing. And so that possibility of regret seems to bias people toward more certain options. And then finally, there's the concept of anchoring, that people tend to latch on to the first piece of information they come upon, even if that information is irrelevant. So there was a really interesting experiment done where people placed values on things like coffee mugs. Uh, but before the experiment started, everyone had to write down the last few digits of their social security number. or they watched a wheel with numbers on it be spun, and the wheel landed on some random number. And what's interesting is that those are going to be random numbers. They have no bearing whatsoever on our valuation of options. And yet, people with higher Social Security numbers tended to place more value on things if they were asked what their number was first. So they have a high number in mind, and now they're asked to put some value on something, and they give a higher value than someone who has a low Social Security number. And again, those two pieces of information are not related at all. But just having higher numbers in mind, being asked to think about higher or lower numbers, can bias our later evaluations. So those are some commonly made errors. But what can we say about decision making and the brain? What parts of the brain seem to be important for different kinds of decision making? So one thing that seems to be important is having an intact prefrontal cortex. So we know about Phineas Gage, who was that railroad worker who suffered a brain injury in the prefrontal cortex. And while accounts vary in terms of the severity of his deficits, he seems to have lost the ability to plan for long-term consequences and to control impulses. And the prefrontal cortex, we now know, is important for both of those capacities. And so long-term planning and impulse control are very important for good decision making. And later studies in the same domain, that is the prefrontal cortex and decision making, led to the development of the somatic marker hypothesis. And this is the idea that the prefrontal cortex is necessary in order to sort of monitor our physiology, that we can have physiological responses to stimuli, in this case to certain options, and that we should pay attention to those responses and they can help guide our decision making. So the classic experiment that looks at this uses something called the Iowa gambling task. And what this is a game in which a person draws from different decks of cards. And each card will have on it some number of points or amount of money that's been won or lost. And so some of these decks of cards are better than others based on their long-term payoff. And people can choose any deck they want. The good decks, again, have a long-term positive payoff, but have a mixture of losses and gains. The bad decks, so to speak, tend to give gains pretty consistently, but they will have an occasional huge loss. And so people choose from these decks and experience them, and they get a feel for what each deck is like. Now, normal individuals, that is those with intact prefrontal cortices, eventually stop choosing from the bad decks. They learn that those big negative penalties come up. And so they stop choosing from those bad decks, but also they have what's called an anticipatory skin conductance response. They break out in a light sweat when they think about choosing the bad deck. So they have a physiological response. Their skin gets clammy. And the idea is that they use that clamminess of the skin and increase in heart rate to guide their decision making. They're thinking about choosing the bad deck. They have a physiological response, and then they think twice about making that choice. Whereas individuals here in the right column that have prefrontal cortex damage, they do not have these physiological responses to these bad decks, and they choose them just as much as they choose the good ones, and they end up doing worse. It ends up being a bad decision. So the somatic marker hypothesis is the idea that we have physiological responses to our options, and that as long as our brain is intact, that we can incorporate that physiological response into the information that we have when we're making a decision. And this has been confirmed looking at brain imaging data, where the prospect of choosing one of these bad decks causes this physiological response, but also causes activity in the area where these prefrontal cortex patients have damage. So we have physiological responses, we have responses in terms of neural activity as well. And decision making is a big area of research. And there are different ways to think about decisions. Anytime you have a tough decision, it reflects that you're trying to compare two options that must be pretty close in value. And values can differ based on not just the literal value of two options. Sometimes we have that decision if we're shopping. But we've already talked about probability, for example. So do you want to take a gamble, or do you want the sure thing? People are biased toward the sure thing, even when the gamble has a bigger average payoff. So here in this diagram in the middle of the slide, we see responses in the brain that depend on the probability of the outcome. So we can see that spike on the left that gets taller as the outcome becomes more sure. So your brain definitely tracks the probability of outcomes. And so that way you can compare a gamble versus a sure thing and decide which one is more valuable to you. There's also the dilemma between the known and the unknown. So this is what's called ambiguity aversion. So there's when you're gambling, of course you don't know what the outcome is going to be, but you can be told what the odds are. So there's some uncertainty, but you know the rules of the game, so to speak. In the known versus unknown dilemma, you don't even know what the probability will be. So the classic example is I give you a container and it's filled with red and blue balls. And I say that we can draw one, and if it's red, that you'll get a prize. And you can either choose this container that has 50 red balls and 50 blue balls, or you can choose this other container, which also has red and blue balls, but I won't tell you the mixture. People tend to choose the 50-50 shot, when in fact that container could contain mostly red or mostly blue. You have no idea. And on average, if it's randomly decided, it would still be a 50-50 gamble. And yet that ambiguity, that lack of knowledge about what even the odds are, tends to drive people away. But that's another way of framing decisions that has been studied extensively. Another big one is whether you want a reward now or a reward later. And now, if the rewards are the same size, people tend to choose now, and that would be rational, because you don't know what's going to happen in the future. The future is uncertain. But if I offer you $10 today or $20 in a week, that might be more tempting. And in fact, a lot of people will choose the $20 in a week. However, if I then offer you $10 in a year or $20 in a year and a week, everyone chooses the second one. Even though a year from now you'll be in the same situation. You'll still be in that $10 now versus $20 in a week situation. And so the context matters. The reward now can be very tempting, and when it's immediate, it seems to get some kind of bonus. And in fact, we can see this in the brain. When an option is immediate, it becomes a lot more attractive. Whereas if you have to wait for a while, then system 2 that we talked about last time starts to kick in. Your more deliberative, rational thinking takes over. And so when evaluating reward now versus reward later, it can be difficult because your impulse is to take the reward now. And so it can be hard to compare options where one is offered now and one is offered later. Of course, decision making can have a moral component. Actions can be ethical and unethical. And this has also gotten a lot of attention recently. And this is often illustrated in what's called the trolley problem. So in this hypothetical scenario, and you may have heard of this, you're standing on a bridge, and there's an out-of-control trolley heading down the track. And further on down the track, there are 5 workers that will be killed by this trolley if you don't do anything about it. You're on the footbridge, and you happen to be standing next to a large individual. If you push that person off the bridge, their body will stop the trolley, and you'll save those 5 people. And you ask people, is that an acceptable thing to do? Most people say no. It is not morally acceptable to push someone in front of the trolley in order to save 5 people. Then you give them another scenario, and you say, okay, you're not on a bridge, you're by a switch. Same trolley is heading down the track, and it will run over those same 5 people. However, if you throw the switch, the track will change, and the trolley will go down another track and only kill 1 person. Is that morally acceptable? Most people in this case say yes, it's okay to throw that switch. In both cases, you are making a decision and either allowing 5 people to die or, by virtue of your actions, killing 1 person. And yet, certain emotional aspects seem to make the difference here. So the act of physically pushing someone versus throwing a switch seems to be important. Also, in the first case, the person is being used instrumentally. They are a means to an end. And we often have moral qualms about doing that. Whereas in the second case, the person is just in the way. So there are different components to moral decision making, some emotional, some rational. So this has gotten a lot of study as well, looking at what parts of the brain are engaged in these moral dilemmas. Okay, so now we understand a little bit more about how we make decisions. The next question is, how do we solve problems? So we're given a problem to solve. How do we do that? How do we get from our current state to the goal state, whether it's solving a literal puzzle or trying to come up with a solution to a technological problem, for example. And one way of doing this is with a means-ends analysis approach. And what you do here is you figure out what the goal state is. So if you're solving a puzzle, then you know that the goal state is having the completed puzzle, having all the pieces in the right spots, in the right orientation, having it be one unified picture. And you have your current state, a jumble of puzzle pieces. And then what you do is you try to reduce the differences. And this is obviously applicable not just to physical, literal puzzles, but to all sorts of problems. You figure out what you need to get to in terms of your goal state, where you are now, and then figure out how to make those two the same. So you can take steps to make the current state more like the goal state. Sometimes this can be a really complex process. It's not as easy as just keeping one goal state in mind and getting there. So you can form what are called sub-goals. And these are intermediate steps. It can be hard to try and tackle the entire problem at once, but if you can come up with a goal state that's sort of halfway there, then it becomes easier to solve that smaller problem. Another way of approaching problem solving is through analogical problem solving. And your book uses a good example here. If you present people with a problem of you have a patient with a tumor and you need to irradiate that tumor, but the amount of radiation you need to kill the tumor is also going to kill surrounding tissue if you just try and zap it in one go. And people have a hard time figuring out the solution to that problem. But if you give them a problem that has a certain thematic similarity, they become better at it. So in this case, they are then, after they're stumped, asked to solve another problem where they're trying to storm a castle. And they have a large enough army to do it, but no bridge into the castle can support the weight of the entire army. So the solution there is to come at the castle from multiple directions. That if you spread the army across the various bridges to the castle, that you can then storm the castle successfully. If you give people that problem and then give them the patient problem again, they are much better at solving it. So they reason by analogy. They realize the utility of coming at the target from multiple directions. And so they realized the tumor problem can be solved by sending multiple weak beams of radiation that all converge on the tumor. And that way, other tissue might get a little radiation, but only the tumor gets the combined dose. So that is a form of analogical problem solving. You're problem solving by analogy. And of course, some problems are solved through creativity and insight. We've all had that aha moment when we're trying to solve a problem. And it turns out that we're not very good at assessing when we're about to solve something. We may feel that the solution is on the tip of our tongue or we're minutes away from solving it. But people's estimates of how quickly a problem is going to be solved are not very good. However, they are pretty good at determining whether a problem is soluble, which is interesting because they don't know the solution. They may be a long way away from coming up with a solution, but they're pretty good at estimating whether it can be solved. So there seems to be a process for assessing the feasibility of a problem that doesn't depend on having a specific solution to it. When it comes to that aha moment, some problems are solved just by grinding away, by coming up with small sub-goals or solving it step by step. And that's different from that aha moment, from having insight, that sudden creative surge. And here, the right temporal lobe in the brain seems to be somehow involved in that aha moment. So this slide on the right is from a study looking at people trying to solve problems, and just as they're solving it, you see this activity, this increase in activity in the right temporal lobe. So there does seem to be a neural correlate to that aha moment. A little bit more on problem solving. So one thing people aren't so good at solving is problems where they have to deal with objects or concepts that they're really familiar with, because they exhibit what's called functional fixedness. And what does that mean? Well, it means when we're familiar with an object especially, that we tend to think of that object in terms of its typical use. We have a hard time thinking outside the box, so to speak. We have a hard time thinking of new uses for an item when we're already familiar with what that item is typically used for. So the classic example here is you're given a box with matches in it and a candle and some thumbtacks. Now, if you read the text in your book, it makes it sound like the problem is just to light a dark room, and that obviously would be easy, just light the candle. The caption to this figure gives you a better picture of what the problem is, and that is that you have to light the room with the candle, but you also don't want the candle wax dripping on anything. So you can't just set the candle on a table or on the floor and light it, because then you'll get candle wax everywhere. So I'll give you a minute to think about how you might solve this problem. How can you light this candle and light the room with these materials and not get candle wax on anything in the room? So in the interest of time, I'll cut that a little bit short. But the solution is to take thumbtacks and pin the matchbox, emptied of matches, of course, to the wall, and then set the candle in the box that's now empty and light it. That way the candle wax collects in the matchbox. People have a hard time coming up with that solution, though, because of functional fixedness. They tend to think of a matchbox as something that holds matches. It's hard for them to think of it as a container for other things, like the candle. And so you have a fixed idea of what the item is for, and it's tough to think of other uses. Similarly, if you have two cords hanging from the ceiling, and you have a number of tools like pliers and a hammer, if the two cords are out of reach, you can't touch both at once. The problem is, how can you grab both cords with just what you have available? And one of the tools is a hammer, and so people will try to come up with ideas of how to use the hammer in its typical fashion to solve the problem, and they can't do it. The trick is to tie the hammer to one of the cords and to use it as a pendulum. So you're effectively just using the hammer as a weight. And again, people have a hard time coming up with that solution because they're used to thinking of a hammer as something that you pound in nails with. So a hammer has a very specific use. And once someone is familiar with that use, it is hard for them to think of other uses. Also, when it comes to creative problem solving, there's an interesting role of expertise. So again, if we're familiar with an item, we're subject to functional fixedness. But also, if we're familiar with a discipline, it can be hard to solve a novel problem. So this is a diagram from a study that looked at a website that proposes problems to solve. So companies or individuals will have a problem they need solved and will offer a prize to people that can solve it. And if you look at who ends up solving these problems, of course, many solutions are developed by individuals in the relevant field. What's interesting, though, is there's also a role of multidisciplinary knowledge. So outsiders can often be very successful at solving a problem, and in this case, outsiders usually just have to draw on their field of interest. Maybe they're not used to thinking of problems like this, and this problem doesn't lie within their usual field, but because they have special outside knowledge, they can be pretty good at solving that with just their particular field. If you're in that field, though, it turns out that you'll often need to call on various disciplines. So this is that idea of multidisciplinary knowledge. If you're an insider, you often have to synthesize related fields to come up with a solution. So there's this interesting interaction between the person's expertise and how many different areas of knowledge they draw on. If you're an outsider, it may be that your area of expertise is exactly what this problem needs, and you don't need to look into other areas of knowledge. If you're an insider, obviously just applying your one field hasn't worked so far. But if you can integrate multiple areas of knowledge, then you stand a good chance of success. In both cases, though, it's true that effort is often required, and a lot of effort. So having that sudden momentary inspiration that solves the problem is rare unless you put a lot of work in first. So all these things matter: expertise, the ability to draw on multiple areas of knowledge, and also effort. These all combine to solve novel problems. So we'll wrap up this unit talking about reasoning. That is how we as individuals reach conclusions about the world around us. And when it comes to reasoning, there are two major kinds. There's practical reasoning, and this is action-oriented. That is reasoning about what sequence of actions we need to take to get to a certain goal, for example. And for example, if you are trying to get to work from home and you discover that your car no longer works, if that's how you usually get to work, then how do you now get there? So you're able to reason through the problem, figure out alternatives, figure out consequences, and decide on a plan of action. So you're reasoning about a set of behaviors you need to make. The other kind of reasoning is theoretical reasoning, and this is reasoning about beliefs. So you're given some information, and you try to update or come up with new beliefs, new statements that are supported by that information. And it turns out that this is difficult for pre-literate societies, that something about being in a literate society supports the development of theoretical reasoning. Now, members of pre-literate societies have no trouble with practical reasoning. They can come up with plans of action all the time and come up with ideas of what a person should do in a situation. But if you're given a set of assumptions and then asked to deduce new information from those assumptions, then being from a literate or pre-literate society makes a big difference. But regardless of your background, uh, there is something called belief bias. And belief bias is our tendency to rely on the believability of a statement rather than its logical validity. And this comes into play with syllogistic reasoning. So if you're given a couple of statements and then told to evaluate a third statement as to whether it's true or not, uh, this is what's called a syllogism. And so you can logically reason from the statements whether that third statement comes from those first two, or that third statement can be deduced from the first two. So your book uses an example of a couple of different syllogisms, and one of them involves the statement at the end that some drugs are inexpensive. There's nothing unbelievable about that statement. Another statement asks you to assess whether uh, cigarettes are not addictive. And people will often say that that statement is not logically valid, when in fact it is from the statements that precede it. It's just that we don't find that statement believable. And so that is the belief bias. Our personal perception of how believable a statement is impacts whether we think it is logically valid, when in fact believability should not uh, be involved in syllogistic reasoning, and yet it is. There's also something called the illusion of explanatory depth, and that is that people tend to have polarized conclusions, especially when it comes to things like political policies, on issues that they don't fully understand. And it's a very common phenomenon. Uh, and the thing is, they may not realize they don't fully understand an issue or even an object, and yet they will believe that they understand it. So, for example, this is from a famous experiment looking at explanatory depth, and they asked people to explain how certain items work, how certain tools work, how certain machines work. And of course, people vary in terms of how accurate and how detailed their explanation is. So this example on the right is a series of example responses when people were asked to explain how a crossbow works. So the one at the top has many parts labeled. The mechanism is fairly well explained. The one at the bottom is the general idea that a crossbow shoots arrows. So there's a lot of variance in terms of how well people can explain a mechanism. And yet people are often unaware that they can't explain something, they don't understand it, until they're forced to try and explain it. And there's an interesting interaction here with people's beliefs, especially when it comes to political or social beliefs, that will have a stance on an issue. It's often an extreme stance. But when you ask someone to explain the issue, they discover they're not very good at explaining the details. They may not understand it very well. And so that can have a moderating influence on their later opinion. But the explanation seems to be key. You just ask them to describe their opinion on the issue, that doesn't change their opinion very much. But if you ask them to explain the issue, then that can, if they discover that they can't explain it very well. So that's how we can counteract this illusion of explanatory depth. By making people try to explain how something works, if they can't explain it, they will often moderate their opinion afterwards. So that's involved, obviously, in their reasoning process. How do they arrive at their conclusion? Well, if it turns out they don't understand the premise very well, they start to question their own conclusions. Okay, that will do it for our unit on thinking and thought. Next time, we'll start talking about something new, a new topic, and that unit will be on development. So we'll talk about childhood, infancy. How do children develop new abilities? What order do they develop new abilities in? What age does this occur at? We are, of course, not born with all of our psychological functions intact. They get added as we age. And some of these are physical abilities or mental abilities, but there's also social and moral development. So we become more socially and morally sophisticated as we grow into adults. And we'll also talk about that period after childhood, where changes aren't as obvious. They're not as frequent, but they still do occur. So we'll talk about development through adolescence and even through adulthood. We are not psychologically constant, so to speak, even as adults. We do change over time. And so we'll talk about that next time. I will see you then.